أنا دكتور خالد وليد، ربان سفينة النجاة إلى شواطئ بكة القدس. I am Dr. Khaled Waleed, the captain of the ship of salvation to the shores of Baka, Jerusalem.
All right, everyone, get ready, because today we're going deep on a story that's been around forever. Jacob, the patriarch and how he became Israel. It's classic Bible stuff. But what if I told you that the name Israel might not be a gift from God after all? Yeah, this deep dive might just shake things up a bit. Our sources suggest this foundational story might not be what we've always believed.
It's amazing how important a name can be to a whole nation's identity. The core idea of Israel, as we know it, is built on this belief that God stepped in, renamed Jacob, and that's how the whole idea of a people and their promised land got started.
It's definitely a powerful concept. But here's where things get interesting and maybe a little controversial. Sources we've looked at suggest that this whole idea of God renaming Jacob is very likely something humans made up, like over a 90% probability based on research. We're talking about a rewrite of history, and the implications are huge.
It makes you think, that's for sure. To understand this better, we have to go back to the source, the book of Genesis, the verses that connect Jacob to the name Israel.
Oh, you mean Genesis 32.28? The one where Jacob wrestles with that mysterious man who then gives him the name Israel?
That's one of them. There's also Genesis 35.10, where God talks directly to Jacob and seems to confirm the new name.
So at first glance, it seems like God clearly renamed him. But you're saying there's more to it?
There is. If you pay close attention, the first hint is that it's a different being doing the renaming in each verse. In the wrestling match, it's this man who people have interpreted as an angel, God in disguise, or even Jesus before he was born. But then later, in the other verse, it's God himself who's talking.
I see what you mean. Two different parts of the Bible, two different versions of how the renaming happened. That definitely raises some questions. And this is where it gets even more interesting, right? Because there's that theory about how Genesis wasn't written by just one person.
You're talking about the documentary hypothesis. It's a pretty accepted theory in biblical scholarship that Genesis, along with other books in the Pentateuch, wasn't written by just one person, but is a compilation of different sources put together over time.
Hold on, you're saying Moses didn't actually write the whole thing like we always learned?
That's what the evidence seems to show. Instead of one writer, we're probably looking at different sources, each with its own style, point of view, and even theological ideas.
Wow, okay, that definitely changes things. So how does this all connect back to Jacob and Israel?
Well, the documentary hypothesis basically says that these different sources were combined and edited over many centuries. Two of the main sources are the Yahwist, or J, which dates back to around 900, 800 BCE, and then there's the priestly source, or P, from around 550, 400 BCE. And get this, Genesis 32.28 with the wrestling match probably comes from the J source, while Genesis 35.0 with God speaking comes from the P source.
So we've got two separate accounts of the renaming, maybe written hundreds of years apart, and each one reflecting what the writer believed and maybe even wanted people to think. It's amazing.
Exactly. It shows how the text evolved over time, how these stories were shaped and changed through the years. And it all leads to that 90% probability from the research we talked about. The idea that Jacob's name was changed to Israel by God was probably something a human writer came up with.
Okay, I am definitely hooked now. We need to dive even deeper into this. But before we do, I want to hear your initial thoughts. Does it surprise you that the name Israel might not have come from God? This is making me rethink a lot of things.
Yeah, it does make you think differently about what we thought we knew, right? And it opens up a whole new way of looking at this really important story.
For sure. But let's be real for a minute. Saying that God didn't rename Jacob to Israel is a big deal. What else supports this whole 90% probability thing?
Okay, so remember we talked about how neither the Gospels nor the Quran say anything about Jacob being renamed Israel? That's a pretty big clue. Those texts not mentioning it at all is significant.
You'd think that if it was such a major event, something God did himself, it would be mentioned in other religious writings, wouldn't you?
Exactly. The fact that it's missing in those texts supports the idea that this part of the Jacob story might have been added later, maybe changed by human authors to make a point.
Okay, I get that.
Yeah.
So are we saying that someone just made up the name Israel to connect a group of people to Jacob? Are we talking about someone rewriting history? Is that what the research says?
It's an interesting idea, isn't it? Dr. Khaled Waleed, the researcher we're talking about, thinks there might have been a big reason to create a family line for the children of Israel, linking them to a famous patriarch like Jacob, even if it wasn't historically accurate.
So Someone, or maybe a group of people, added this name change to the story to give a specific group a claim to heritage, and maybe even a claim to land.
That's one way to look at it. It makes you think about how stories, even sacred ones, can be influenced by what people want and need, especially when it comes to identity and where they belong.
Wow, there's a lot to consider here. This is more than just changing a name. We're talking about how history gets written, who benefits from certain versions of the past, and how stories can be used for certain agendas.
You're getting at some really important points here. By looking deeper into the origins of this seemingly simple story, we have to face the complex ways in which history is written, who benefits from certain versions of the past, and how narratives can be used to serve various agendas.
This is really mind-blowing. It makes you think about all the other stories we believe, without question, not just in the Bible, but throughout history. How can we even know what's true and what's been changed or even made up over time?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's what makes studying history so interesting. We have to be willing to ask questions, to look at the evidence carefully, and be open to different interpretations, even if they challenge the things we've always believed.
I'm starting to see how this whole thing with Jacob and Israel is about way more than just a name. It's helping us understand the connection between history, identity, and the power of stories.
Exactly. And that's what makes this research so important. It encourages us to look beyond one single origin story and be open to a more detailed and maybe even complicated understanding of the past.
I'm totally with you there. So we've said that it's very likely that God didn't rename Jacob, exceeding a 90% probability based on research. So what does this mean in the grand scheme of things? How does this change the way we understand Israel as a nation? This is where it really gets you thinking, right? Wow, this is really something else. We've been talking about how the story of Jacob being renamed Israel by God is most likely made up. Over 90% probability according to research. But what does it all mean? How does this change how we see Israel as a nation?
That's the big question, isn't it? It challenges a fundamental story that has shaped the identity of millions for centuries. It's understandable if it feels a bit unsettling.
I have to admit, I'm kind of wondering if this means the whole story is made up. Like, there's no historical truth to Israel at all. That would be a massive thing.
It's important to be accurate here. The research we've talked about specifically questions whether the renaming was done by God. It doesn't erase the fact that the Israelite people existed, their culture, or their religious traditions.
Okay, that's good to hear.
Yeah.
But I'm still trying to wrap my head around the idea that the name Israel might be something humans created. How does that change our view of the nation's history?
It encourages us to think beyond one single origin story and consider a more complex and nuanced picture. It suggests that national identity is formed over time, influenced by many factors like cultural changes, political realities, and evolving religious beliefs.
So instead of a simple straight line from Jacob to Israel, we're talking about layers of history, interpretations built on top of each other, and maybe even reinterpretations with specific goals in mind.
Exactly. And that's true for so many stories about nations all over the world, not just Israel. It reminds us that history is rarely a straightforward, objective account. It's more like a tapestry woven from multiple threads, often with competing perspectives and interpretations vying for dominance.
This really shifts how I see the Bible. It's not just a bunch of simple historical accounts. It's a collection of texts written, edited, and put together over centuries, reflecting the beliefs, priorities, and maybe even agendas of the people who shaped them.
That's a great way to put it. And that's why it's important to look at these texts and historical stories in general with a critical eye. To ask questions, to consider the historical context, and to understand that even the most sacred stories can be shaped by human hands.
This deep dive has been quite a journey. We started with a familiar story and ended up questioning a basic narrative. If you had to sum it up, what's the main takeaway for our listeners?
I think it's a strong reminder that even our most cherished beliefs and the stories we think are unquestionable should be looked at critically and with an open mind. It's about embracing complexity and realizing that history is rarely black and white.
Absolutely. And I think it's also about recognizing that humans play a role in how history and identity are constructed. We love to tell stories, and those stories, even the ones we consider sacred, are always shaped by our perspectives, needs, hopes, and sometimes even our wants.
I like how you put that. This deep dive has taken us into the world of biblical scholarship, and I hope it's made our listeners curious to learn more.
For sure. So if the name Israel has human origins and not divine ones like we've always thought, how does that change how we understand the nation's history, its identity, its place in the world? That's a question worth thinking about, and one that's going to keep people talking and debating for a long time.
One thing's for sure, history is rarely simple. And the stories we tell about the past have a big impact on how we see the present and shape the future.
This has been a really eye-opening exploration. What are your thoughts, everyone listening? What stuck with you from this deep dive? Does this new way of looking at Jacob and Israel connect with how you understand history, identity, and belief? Think about these questions as you continue to explore the world around you. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep digging deeper.
أنا دكتور خالد وليد، ربان سفينة النجاة إلى شواطئ بكة القدس. I am Dr. Khaled Waleed, the captain of the ship of salvation to the shores of Baka, Jerusalem.